Everyone.
Hello.
My name is Sharon Kyle, and I'd like to welcome you to our forum, the ACLU Pasadena-Foothills chapter, which includes Pasadena, Glendale, and the northern part of Los Angeles, has these forums every other month. They provide us with an opportunity to talk to our community and to share information that is topical. And tonight we're going to be talking about Colin Kaepernick, who pretty much started the Take a Knee movement, and the relationship between what Colin Kaepernick is doing and the First Amendment. We have a great team of panelists. To my immediate left is John Turanian. John is a law professor at Southwest College of Law. He specializes in both media, entertainment law, and seems to know quite a bit about constitutional law as well. And beside John is Steve Rohde. Steve Rohde is also a constitutional lawyer. He's a lecturer, a writer, and definitely an activist. And Steve sits with me and several people in this room on the board of the ACLU. And to his left is Jim Misella. And Jim is a member of our chapter. He's also engaged in the ACLU downtown. And it was his idea to have this one because Jim really loves football, loves civil liberties and civil rights, and he also is an attorney and is very involved in what we call Constitution Day, where Jim goes to high schools across this area and teaches high school students about the Constitution. Unfortunately, I wish more of our high schools just taught it and they didn't need Jim. It looks like a lot of our students don't know very much about the Constitution. So I want to thank you for being here, and I hope this proves to be as exciting as the side conversations we've been having. So my name is Sharon Kyle. I've already told you that. I'm the publisher of the LA Progressive, and LA Progressive is a social justice magazine. Before we talk to our panelists, I want to tell you a little bit about the research that I did in preparation for tonight's panel session. First of all, I'm really not into football. I do know about the Take a Knee movement, but not because I'm a football fan, because I am the mother of a black man, and I actually believe that every mother of a black man should have a law degree in this country. Because our country is, well, we have some challenges in that regard. I want to say a little bit about the national anthem. Jim is going to tell us, he's going to give us the background of Colin Kaepernick and how this whole thing started. But I want to talk about the national anthem just briefly. So the Star Spangled Banner was written by Francis Scott Key, and he wrote it during the War of 1812. And most of us, when we were in high school, we heard the story of how he penned this poem while he was taken prisoner. But I later found out that there's actually much more to that story. So Francis Scott Key was an aristocrat. He was an attorney working in the Washington, D.C. area. He was pro-slavery. He was anti-abolitionist. And if he had his druthers, black chattel slavery would have existed forever in the United States. During the War of 1812, he was a lieutenant. And there was one particular battle where there were a group of escaped slaves who had joined the British side, fighting in opposition to the Americans. They were called the Colonial Marines. And these Colonial Marines got in a battle in which Francis Scott Key was a lieutenant, and Scott Key and his men had their behinds handed to them. He was very upset that these inferior people were able to beat them. A couple of months later, okay, so he ran away. He was not taken prisoner. But a couple of months later, he went to the British to try to negotiate the release of one of his men who was taken prisoner. And while he was trying to negotiate this release, there was another battle. And the next battle also, the colonial Marines were involved. The British won that battle as well. However, there was a lot of blood loss. There were a lot of casualties, much more casualties on the British side than there had been in the earlier battle. And as Francis Scott Key was watching this battle, he saw that the flag continued to fly. And that's where he wrote the Star-Spangled Banner. But the Star-Spangled Banner didn't automatically become the national anthem. And the reason it didn't become the national anthem is because the third stanza is a stanza where Francis Scott Key is so happy and rejoicing in the loss of lives of black people. And he says in the third stanza, "And where is that band who so wantonly swore that the havoc of war and the battle's confusion, a home and a country, should leave us no more? Their blood has washed out their foul footsteps' pollution. No refuge could save the hireling and slave from the terror of flight or the gloom of the grave. And the Star-Spangled Banner in triumph doth wave over the land of the free and the home of the brave." So just so you know, this protest, when this Star-Spangled Banner is sung, and this protest is a protest that I think all Americans should understand the history of our country and the history of this national anthem that we all say we treasure so much. So having said that, I'm going to take it over to Jim. And Jim, why don't you tell us the history of Colin Kaepernick and this whole story and how it came to be?
So, as Sharon said, we are here to talk about the First Amendment, which is, I teach the Constitution in the high schools, and I say to the kids, what kind of freedoms do you have? And they all say, we have the right of freedom of speech. So the First Amendment is the right to speak freely. It was written into the Constitution 231 years ago. And what this forum is about is, did Colin Kaepernick actually, was he able to exercise his right of free speech when he knelt down during the playing of the national anthem, which the Supreme Court calls expressive speech. Kneeling down isn't speaking, obviously, but it's an expression of a point of view, an expression of an opinion. He was a player who still has enough talent to play quarterback in the National Football League. That is, until last year. Now, no team is willing to have him as a player. I just, by coincidence, happened to be present for his breakout game in 2012. My wife and I traveled to the Bay Area to watch the San Francisco 49ers play the Chicago Bears. Having grown up in Chicago, we are Bear fans. Obnoxiously so. It was a Monday night football game, televised, and both of the regular quarterbacks for each team were injured. That's very common in pro football. The quarterbacks are small, skilled, and everybody else, all the other players are humongous. So the quarterbacks, and they actually try to hurt the quarterbacks, because if you hurt the quarterback, it gives you a big advantage. Except for Ross, you can see you have some Pittsburgh people here tonight. So.
No, she said he's big.
He has very quick feet for a big guy, Ben Roethlisberger. Anyway, that night both teams relied on their backup quarterbacks. And the 49ers defeated the lowly Bears, Who had one of the best defenses? They always have good defense in football. The final score was 32 to 7. 32 to 7. Who was this backup quarterback that soundly defeated my Bears? Who is Colin Kaepernick? Okay, so the quarterback on a professional football team is the most important player on the field. There are 22 players on the team and many more participating during the game, but the quarterback is the player that will win or lose a game for you. After that game against the Bears, Colin Kaepernick became the regular 49er quarterback, and they began winning. He led the 49ers to the Super Bowl. Okay, that's a big deal, the Super Bowl. Led them to the Super Bowl that year. They did lose by 3 points. The following year, he led them to the NFC Final, the game right before the Super Bowl. So he was doing very well as a quarterback, a regular starting quarterback. Colin Kaepernick is tall. He's 6 feet 5 inches tall, which is really great for a quarterback, because when you go back to pass, these huge hulking players in front of you, they're all waving their hands. You can see over them a little bit better when they're tall. He is also fast and very elusive. So if nobody's open to throw a pass to, he simply tucks the ball under his arm and runs for yardage. There are some NFL quarterbacks who could do both these things, but there aren't too many. As a young child, he was adopted by the Kaepernick family in Wisconsin, but is of mixed race, his birth father being a never, as far as I know, identified African American. Quarterbacks should also be smart. They have to outthink the other team. When they stand at the line of scrimmage, you'll see them, they're calling plays. They're looking at the defense, they're calling plays. They're changing the play. They're driving their coaches crazy because they're changing the play. But they have to be very smart. He had a 4-point GPA in high school. He was an honor student in Turlock High School, California, and he played 3 sports. In 2016, after playing regularly for 4 years as a professional, he found himself standing on the sidelines during the playing of the national anthem. It was a preseason game. As he stood there, he thought about all the persons of color that were being shot by the police. And he found that he couldn't just stand there and do nothing. So instead of standing at attention, he took a knee. He knelt down, and that began it. In the months after, many NFL players knelt down during the anthem. Kneeling during the anthem became contagious, and the practice spread to younger football players and to other sports. It has caused quite a stir. I heard about it, and I had not even seen a game yet that year. This summer, Roger Goodell, NFL commissioner, issued an order that players cannot kneel during the anthem on the field, must do it in the dressing rooms while the anthem is playing. There have always been rules, by the way, always rules for professional players, what they should do during the national anthem. Baseball, basketball, hockey, football. The Players Association quickly filed a grievance. And while they are negotiating now, members of at least 4 teams knelt on the field last week. It was the first week of the preseason. Since the end of the 2017 season, Kaepernick has not played football because he left the 49ers. You have this in your contract, you can opt out. You opt out when you think you're going to get a better deal, either from your team or another team. But at that point, no other team would pick him up. In 2017, he sued the National Football League for collusion by blackballing him from playing. Tom Brady, the preeminent quarterback for the New England Patriots and friend of Donald Trump, agrees that Kaepernick has enough ability and and should be playing. Pastor Toulos of the National Action Network, led by Al Sharpton, has led demonstrations about Kaepernick at Los Angeles Chargers and Rams games. His group also demonstrated recently outside the National Football League offices in Manhattan. Okay, so I'm going to mention a few legal issues about freedom of speech and expression and the pledge to the flag. First of all, the First Amendment. Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof or abridging the freedom of speech or the press or the right of people to assemble and to petition the government for redress of grievances. So no one in the government, the legislature, the president, or the courts may prohibit the exercise of free speech. In 1939, we had a 1989, a case, Texas versus Johnson. This is a flag burning case. Can you burn the American flag? Obviously, where someone can see it. The Supreme Court said even though burning the flag was against state laws, this was in 1989, 48 states had laws against burning the flag. State laws in 48 states, burning the American flag was an act of expressive speech, protected by the First Amendment and not against the law. The court said that even though the act might offend people, obviously it offends a lot of people, it was not illegal unless the act itself disturbed the peace, like I guess you burn the flag and you set the room on fire, you set the building on fire or something. Now we have another case, I love this case, West Virginia versus Barnett, 1944. Must children salute the flag during the Pledge of Allegiance? 1944. The Supreme Court ruled that school children who were members of the Jehovah's Witnesses cannot be made to salute the flag during the pledge. The court completely reversed the decision it had made 4 years before in the Minersville case, where it said that Jehovah's Witnesses children had to salute the flag. Court historians think that the experience of the German concentration and extermination camps had a profound effect on the Supreme Court in the 4 years between the cases. In the later case, where they allowed children not to salute the flag, they said, this is a great quote, "Those who begin coercive elimination of dissenters find themselves exterminating dissenters." Kaepernick and his legal team have one large legal hurdle to climb. Generally, to claim a violation of the First Amendment, a plaintiff must show that the government was the violator. Presumably, a private business or a person can use whatever legal means it has to silence your opinions. Your employer may fire you if you try to speak freely, utter your opinions about political opinions about anything. The National Football League is a private business, and so may censor an employee's or player's right of free speech. So, here's the question. Do we really have the right of freedom of speech in America? However, Kaepernick's lawyers may be able to show that the censoring of his right to free speech was caused by, and therefore, the act of the government, namely, President Donald Trump. Who else? And NFL owners are merely acting as agents of the president. Now, here's the evidence. The NFL teams have acted in unity, in collusion to prevent Kaepernick from playing. They all are doing it. As a matter of fact, at least one of them has said recently it would be interested in hiring him if he promised not to kneel during the anthem. Dallas Cowboys owner Jerry Jones has testified that Donald Trump has been actively involved in the owner's decisions not to hire Colin Kaepernick, and that they were afraid that the president's negative remarks would adversely affect what else? Stadium ticket sales and television viewing. Trump also threatened the owners with new tax assessments if they did not deal with the kneeling by players issue. Well, they're still kneeling, so we'll see what he's going to do. Vice President Pence, and this is sort of obviously a staged act, sat in a stadium, I think it was in Washington, D.C., before a live 49er game, and then when Kaepernick and other players knelt for the anthem, he walked out. President Trump has often spoken of kneeling players and those who locked arms, saying the owner should fire them. He just commented again in the last few days about the players who knelt last week. Colin Kaepernick is probably more famous now than when he played. He has acted in Know Your Rights camps all over the country. Kids attend to see Colin and have their pictures taken with him. Kaepernick's case is still ongoing, and NFL players still seem to be kneeling. I was asked by the gentleman from the TV station, do I think that the issue will continue? Yeah, the issue is going to continue. The players are still kneeling. I don't see it going away. When you look at the characters in this drama, the only person not trying to gain money or power is Colin Kaepernick. The idealist is the loser.
I agree with Jim. It is going to continue. It's going to continue as long as there are these killings and as long as we have the huge disparities, racial disparities in pretty much every realm. I was preparing for an article I was writing about Cheney, Goodman, and Schwerner, who were the three men who were killed in the 1950s during the Freedom Riders. They were killed in Mississippi. In the 60s. Thank you, Granny. When I was doing this research for this article, I ran across a website called Civil Rights Cold Case Project. And that was a project that was created by a Canadian man by the name of David Richkin. He was making a documentary about this Mississippi case from the 60s. And he was looking at some old footage that was taken during the actual dredging of the Mississippi River when they were trying to find the bodies of these three freedom fighters. And he heard on the documentary, he actually noticed that as they were dredging up, they'd find a femur, or they'd find part of a rib cage, or they'd find, this sounds really grotesque, but this is true. And what the authorities, they look at the remains and they say, oh, that's the wrong body. Yes. And they would throw it back in. So I bring up this point to emphasize that the Take a Knee movement and all of the other protests are about a very serious matter. That being that America, the vast majority of Americans, have no idea how many of our people have been lynched, how many unarmed black men and women are brought down by law enforcement officers. And that's why this will continue. And make no mistake about it, many of these football players themselves are targets. So this is something that they're living with. Now we're going to be talking to Steve Rohde, who's a constitutional lawyer, and he's going to give us a little bit of the background of the First Amendment and how this applies to this case. Steve.
Thank you very much. Thank you, everybody, for being here. This is a very important issue, and what I'm going to try to do is put the Colin Kaepernick case into a context of the challenges and attacks on freedom of speech and freedom of the press in our current era. I want to add that I got to meet Colin and shake his hand. He was a surprise honoree at the last ACLU dinner, which I believe was last November or December, our annual dinner. Many of us were there. And I just took a deep breath and went over to his table, and I'm pretty tall, but I had to look up 5 inches to him. He was very gracious. He was very humble. He was overwhelmed by recognition that our affiliate of the ACLU was according him. He had to sneak in the back of the hotel. There were fears of threats against him and the ACLU for honoring him. But it was a historic moment, and I think when they write the history of freedom of speech and freedom of the press in this tumultuous period that we are struggling through, I think Colin would deserve an entire chapter all to itself. You know, you've got a couple lawyers on this panel, but Jim did an excellent job of recounting the key legal issues in that case. We lawyers call it state action, to invoke the First Amendment, which begins, "Congress shall make no law," which was later interpreted to apply to states and cities. You need state action in order to invoke the First Amendment. And Jim has well outlined what Colin's lawyers believe they are onto. Other essential points are that there are tax breaks that NFL teams have received until recently, when the NFL relinquished its tax-exempt status in 2015. Many of their stadiums are underwritten by tax breaks. But in the era of Trump, nothing goes on without Trump's stain on it. And those tweets that are serving to be such good evidence against Trump in so many arenas are proving to be good evidence now. His tweet was, "Why is the NFL getting massive tax breaks while at the same time disrespecting our anthem, flag, and country? Change tax law." So there's a very solid theory that when a private party is in conspiracy or collusion with the government, that may give standing to people like Colin to invoke his First Amendment rights. There was a 1963 case in which a private company had become a state actor because a government entity used the threat of invoking legal sanctions and other means of coercion, persuasion, and intimidation to induce private entities to act in a way that chills free speech rights. So there's a lot of solid law. I got several emails upon the announcement of today's program asking me, why was this even a legitimate program? Colin Kaepernick didn't have First Amendment rights vis-a-vis the NFL. Well, I think we've demonstrated that he does, and I'm hopeful the courts will recognize that as this case goes forward. And now that we've highlighted it, I hope you will stay abreast and pay even more attention to these important rights, all of which, of course, is based on the underlying questions of racism that are so endemic to so many issues that we're trying to address in America these days. What Trump has done is taken the lid off of deep veins and the deep history of racism in this country. He didn't start it. He's inflaming it, as he couldn't resist doing again with Charlottesville and Washington, D.C. this weekend, and 1 year ago this weekend. So it is a moment of historical lessons, and our job is to steel ourselves, to equip ourselves to resist. And I think that's what so many of us are doing. I do want to take a few minutes to tell you about these threats to freedom of the press. It is so serious that a group of press organizations have come together to release the first review of U.S. Press Freedom Tracker for the year 2017. This is the first time that the Knight Ridder newspaper chain Knight First Amendment Institute at Columbia University, the Reporters Committee for Freedom of the Press, Reporters Without Borders, Index on Censorship, and the Freedom of Press Foundation came together to prepare this report, which any of you can find by looking up U.S. Press Freedom Tracker. And they put the resources into gathering up the evidence and the statistics. You know, we see these moments go by on the TV news or in your newspapers, but it's shocking when you realize the extent to which the press has been under attack. For example, nearly half of all press freedom incidents occurred at protests. Police arrested journalists at least 34 times, and 85% of those arrests occurred at protests where police often used a controversial kettling technique to arrest people en masse, thereby including bystanders and journalists. There's a rising tide of hostility toward the press, which coincides with 45 physical attacks on journalists. I mean, you may have heard a story here and a story there, but for the year 2017, there were 45 attacks. The news media has faced an unprecedented number of verbal attacks by public officials, including, of course, Donald Trump, who called the news media the enemy of the people and truly dishonest people and fake news. Trump encouraged direct government interference with the press, repeatedly calling for changes to libel laws to make it easier for people to sue newspapers, calling for suggesting that the FCC should challenge licenses of TV networks whose coverage he disliked, urging the Senate Intelligence Committee to investigate networks, calling for news organizations to fire their reporters when they're critical of him, and reportedly urging the FBI to jail reporters for publishing classified information. AT&T also called into question whether Trump's Justice Department's opposition to the merger with Time Warner was part of that conspiracy. The Trump Justice Department has thus far only brought charges in one case involving unauthorized disclosures, that of the woman reality winner who allegedly gave The Intercept a top-secret document detailing Russian hacking. But given that the Justice Department is reportedly investigating 27 leak cases as of November 2017, there may be more prosecutions in the future. Let me just recount that based on all of these attacks on the press, Floyd Abrams, a leading First Amendment lawyer and scholar, described how the current administration has departed from historic practice. Quote, unhappiness with and criticism of the press by American presidents has been the norm, not the exception. But daily denigration of the press as the enemy of the American people and statements that the use of confidential sources by journalists shouldn't be allowed is both novel and dangerous. Finally, the tracker, this report, has highlighted 11 instances in which the government denied access to reporters. The most high-profile were denials of access when the White House excluded journalists from 11 news organizations from an informal press gathering, allowing only the press pool and several hand-picked outlets to attend. There were 3 instances in which government officials prevented reporters from covering protests. 2 of those occurred inside the U.S. Capitol. In January, a congressman blocked a journalist from photographing a protest, and in July last year, U.S. Capitol police officers ordered a journalist to delete photos and videos of protesters that he had filmed in the Senate hallways, implicating the journalist's Fourth Amendment rights as well as his First Amendment rights. I've spent some time detailing these because I want you to appreciate the breadth and the depth of these attacks on freedom of the press in these last few years. When political scientists have studied the rise of fascism, they variously identify 10 or 14 factors that culminate in the imposition of an authoritarian or fascist government. In every analysis, it is the undermining of a free press that is at the heart of that rise toward fascism and authoritarianism. It is no exaggeration for us to sound an alarm that that's exactly what's going on in the United States today. We have a very dangerous situation which is already implicating surveys that are finding greater hostility against the press among vast portions of the American public. A lot of the tweets and the repetition and the demagoguery of Donald Trump is having an impact. It is undermining the free press because the day will come in one setting or another, whether it is impeachment, whether it is the litigation over conflicts of interest and the emoluments clause of the U.S. Constitution, whether it's the Mueller report or Mueller indictments, when this president may have to stand up and he will call for resistance of his own against the civic institutions in our country, including a free press. That's what we've got to equip ourselves and be prepared for. That's why Colin Kaepernick is such a hero today, and that's why we've got to protect freedom of the press. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Steve. So Colin Kaepernick refused to be humble, unassuming, and supportive of the established order. And that's what is not liked by the likes of this current administration. But Colin Kaepernick is not the first athlete to protest. But there's a long history of this. Some people say that Jack Johnson, who in 1912 was the heavyweight champion of the world, a black man just 50 years after the abolition of slavery in the United States, he married a white woman. He opened up an integrated restaurant. He was arrested and actually served a year for transporting a woman for immoral purposes, the woman being his wife, transporting her over state lines. But this tradition of protest is one that black athletes have done for many, many years. We know about Muhammad Ali refusing to accept the draft and go to Vietnam. There was a cost associated with him doing that. He lost his belt and he wasn't able to fight for a while during his, some might argue, his peak period. We all know Tommy Jones and John Carlos in the 1968 Olympics, who stood in protest in Mexico City with their fists in the air. That's one of my earliest memories of protest. And actually seeing that was sort of awakened me to the injustices. I remember asking my dad, why are they doing that? A lot of people don't know that Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, for that same Olympics, he protested by boycotting. He didn't go to the Olympics because of what was happening in the 60s around civil rights issues. But Kareem Abdul-Jabbar's form of protest wasn't as public, so it was deemed more acceptable. And his ability to continue to earn a living and his reputation and his career weren't hurt by his boycott. On the other hand, Tommy Jones and John Carlos, neither of them were able to capitalize. Am I saying Tommy Smith?
Tommy Smith. Yes.
Tommy Smith. Neither one were able to capitalize on their Olympic wins. Dick and I went and we heard Tommy Smith speak once, and he talked about how after that there were times when he had a hard time getting food. So there is a price to pay, and right now Colin Kaepernick is paying it. That's not the first time. So now we're going to talk to John Turanian, and when we were chatting about who was going to talk about what, we said, okay, so Jim Nisella knows football, and Steve Brody knows the First Amendment, and I'm black. John says, well, throw anything at me. I got you covered. So John, why don't you come up here and talk to us about your views on this issue?
Thanks so much for the great introduction, and Jim, thanks for putting the sports context out to all of us, and Steve to raising all the very important freedom of press issues that are part and parcel of the Kaepernick controversy. Just want to note, Sharon, actually, Kareem Abdul-Jabbar has I think, in my view at least, suffered quite a bit in his career because of his civil rights work. He's an individual who has never been hired by the NBA as a general manager, despite seeing many of his peers in equivalent positions. He's been effectively blacklisted. And last I heard, he was teaching, a high school basketball team because that's the only people who would hire him. This is a guy who's incredibly intelligent, incredibly erudite. You guys have read his columns. He's stood up for civil rights time and time again. And in a sense, I think if you asked him, he would probably suggest he has been blacklisted very much for his political views. And I think that's a theme here, which is unfortunately, when you stand up, you pay the price sometimes. And this is a price that Kareem Abdul-Jabbar paid. It's the price that Muhammad Ali paid for a while, at least, until the public sort of forgave him in the famous second act of his life. It's a price that another athlete that we didn't talk about, Curt Flood, paid. Curt Flood, of course, was a very famous outfielder for the St. Louis Cardinals, who was against his will traded to the Philadelphia Phillies. Philadelphia being known as the southernmost north city in the land, a place of, deep racial divides. And Curt Flood said, listen, I'm not a piece of chattel to be traded. I'm not a slave. And he stood up to Major League Baseball and the infamous reserve clause. And with nary any support from his fellow teammates, from the league, took his case all the way to the Supreme Court and lost. And basically, that was the end of his career. He never played again. A couple years later, free agency became a thing that made many athletes millions and millions of dollars. Curt Flood died in poverty and never saw the benefit of the thing he stood up for. I should know Jackie Robinson was the one player that stood up for him and actually showed up to the Supreme Court on the day of his hearing before the Supreme Court. But no active baseball player bothered to support him. So Colin Kaepernick, he's gotten some support. I would say I'm actually quite disappointed that he hasn't gotten more support, in particular from non-black athletes. When one looks at who is doing the kneeling, it's a little disappointing to see it's only black athletes. There was one player on the Cleveland Browns who was white. He just happened to be married to an African-American woman. He kneeled as well. But that highlights this terrible, terrible racial divide that still plagues our country. About 10 years ago, we were electing the first African Americans in the U.S. presidency. And we had some people that were a little too enthusiastic about that, claiming that this was proof that racism was over, that we lived in a colorblind world and everything was equal now. And you look at what's happened in the last 10 years. You look at what's happened in the last few years. You look at Charlottesville. You look at Ferguson. You look at the Black Lives Matters movement. You look at what happened to Colin Kaepernick. And it's clear racial divides are still at the center of so many controversies in our country. We're not a colorblind country yet, far from it. And the divides continue to plague us. And yet, there is a big difference in perception between how whites and blacks perceive race in our country and continue to perceive race in our country. The majority of whites actually feel that the socioeconomic conditions of blacks and whites are roughly equal. That's a Gallup poll. Now, no matter what you think about whether people are treated equally, the idea that the socioeconomic conditions of blacks and whites are roughly equal in our country is farcical. In fact, it's far from it. And what Colin Kaepernick is protesting, we shouldn't lose sight of it, it's his freedom of speech to protest it. But what he is protesting, racial injustice, he's doing it specifically in the context of the criminal justice system, but that also begins with socioeconomic disparities. And what are those socioeconomic disparities? Let me give you just one figure to put all of this in context. To me, the most shocking piece of data from the 2010 census, the latest census that gives us this data, and that is the average wealth of black families in our country versus the average wealth of white families in our country. The average African-American family in our country in 2010 had a median wealth of $4,995. The average white family had a median wealth of $110,000. That's a 22-to-1 difference. So for the average white person to think that the socioeconomic conditions of blacks and whites is quote-unquote roughly equal, and there's a 22-to-1 wealth disparity, is stunning. It's a complete lack of awareness. And it shows us that the vestiges of slavery and systemic oppression are still with us in 2018. By the way, that 2010 census, a 22-to-1 difference, it was the worst difference since the census started calculating the disparity between blacks and whites. So yes, things have certainly gotten better. Yes, we don't practice, de jure segregation, but those numbers have actually gotten worse. There is an incredible, enormous divide. And when you have that much disparity in a country that is capitalistic, where power derives from wealth, it's not surprising that you're going to see vast differences in treatment in the criminal justice system, vast differences in the way people react when you're engaging in things like protest or speech. Now let's talk about speech. Let's talk about protest and what Colin Kaepernick is doing. Now, I'm not quite as sanguine as my panelists as to whether there's a First Amendment violation here. I want there to be a First Amendment violation. I wish there were a First Amendment violation, but I also know that courts don't like the state action doctrine. They're not going to interpret it very broadly. Certainly a Supreme Court that is padded with more conservative judges is probably not going to have a very broad view of the First Amendment, at least when it comes to this type of question. Let's be honest about that. And part of the problem is the one that both Jim and Steve identified, which is that the First Amendment requires government action for a violation to occur. Now, yes, there is some nexus between football, publicly financed stadiums, what the president is doing in Twitter, and the way the owners are reacting. On the other hand, it's probably not enough, as far as I can see, for most courts to say there is a First Amendment violation. But for me, that doesn't end the challenge. Although the Colin Kaepernick issue may not be a First Amendment issue, it is a freedom of speech issue. It is a civil rights issue. It is a social justice issue. And there are other vehicles besides the federal Constitution which we can rely on to actually give a voice to his challenge. So, for example, there's the California Constitution. California has its own version of the First Amendment, one that has been interpreted by courts more broadly than the federal First Amendment. That's important. There's something in California called the Leonard Law. This is a law that basically says that students in schools in California, whether public or private, have full First Amendment rights. In other words, what the Barnett case gave, that Jim talked about earlier, giving public school students the right to say, no, I will not salute the flag, California legislatively has done for private students. And it's given that power under a case called Pruneyard, which allows California to have a more extensive and expansive protection of First Amendment rights compared to the federal government's First Amendment. So there is hope and promise there. There is also, obviously, the voice of people. Now, many people who are against the Colin Kaepernick protest say, well, he's being disrespectful. Or, look, he can protest, just don't do it on my time. Or why is he conflating sports and politics? It is a bit of a laughable question when you think about, is he the one conflating sports and politics? Last I checked, who introduced the national anthem. They didn't used to play the national anthem every game. In fact, most major sporting events didn't until the early Cold War era, where we wanted to rally people to support against the Soviets. There's nothing endemic about the use of the national anthem in sports. By the way, how do you feel about showing up to your workplace and having to stand and do a Pledge of Allegiance every day? How many of you do that? Probably none. Why do we force athletes to do it? If we want to remove politics from sport, well then we should look to the owners. Not what Colin Kaepernick is doing. He's responding to the introduction of politics in sports. And it's an unsavory introduction, as many of you probably know. A couple of years ago, there was a mini scandal which didn't get as much press as I thought it should, which was the Pentagon was found sending millions of dollars to the NFL to pay them to honor veterans. Senator McCain passed the bill to stop that practice. But again, if the NFL is so intent on being patriotic, why does it do it for pay? Why not do it for free in these publicly financed stadiums that we've given these billionaire owners? Important questions to ask, but that aren't sufficiently enough of the public dialogue. Now, Colin Kaepernick does have legal challenges. It's going to have an uphill battle fighting to show this is government action under the First Amendment here. But there could be reforms. We could talk about legislation to protect people in the workplace from compelled speech of a political nature. If the football stadium is a workplace, and it sure is for him, well, I mean, why wouldn't we extend to him the same courtesy that we give all the rest of us? When I show up to my law firm, I don't have to do a Pledge of Allegiance. I don't have to sing the Star Spangled Banner. Maybe I want to, maybe I don't, but it's my choice if I do. And why don't we respect that? Because frankly, that's what makes America great, right? That is the ACLU's slogan. Dissent is patriotic. And I think it's incredibly important to stand up and support the dissent, even when we don't agree with it, to stand up to not just mitigate or vindicate First Amendment values, but this broader notion of freedom of the conscience, freedom of expression. And so I think it's important not to lose sight of the social justice issues behind what Colin Kaepernick is doing, but it's also important to note that even if his legal travails do not result in success for him, think about Curt Flood. He lost in front of the Supreme Court. 2 years later, free agency became the law of the land because of what he did. There are other ways to get to the core of expanding expressive rights for individuals, much like California did in 1992 when it passed the Leonard Law and gave private school students the same First Amendment rights that public school students have. There's nothing preventing that. And I think that's where the future battle lies. Colin Kaepernick's best legal challenge is probably on the collective bargaining agreement, to be perfectly honest. Right? There may not be a First Amendment violation here, but under Section 17 of the collective bargaining agreement that the NFL players have with the NFL as a whole, the clubs are not allowed to collude in any way in terms of denying employment opportunities. Has there been collusion here? Yeah. There certainly seems to be a lot of proof. And the Twitter tweets by Donald Trump seem to egg that on, to coordinate actions by the owners not to consider hiring Kaepernick, even in situations last year where teams were going to their second or third string or even fourth string quarterbacks. No one bothered to think about hiring Colin Kaepernick. Why not? That seems unusual. And then when you see, NFL owners like Jerry Jones come out last week and say that under no circumstances will any player of his play and disrespect the flag by kneeling. Or you have Donald Trump egging on the owners, which of course Donald Trump, ironically, in my view, is carrying on his own vendetta when he sued the NFL a number of years ago through the USFL, which he founded, and he lost. Well, he got $3 in damages. And they didn't allow him to own the Buffalo Bills. So he really hates the NFL. He doesn't want the NFL to be patriotic. He just wants wants to do anything to make the NFL look bad. And he's actually done a very good job of that because he's created absolute panic within the ownership, and you see the kind of quagmire that everybody is stuck in right now in the preseason with only a couple of weeks left before the season starts. The process that Glendale put into place was pretty clearly a violation of the collective bargaining agreement, so it was taken off the table, and now the Players Association and Glendale are in the process of negotiating something else. What happens, who knows? But for all of us, even if legal challenges aren't successful, there are other means to attack this issue and stand up for the right of individuals to express their freedom of conscience, to not force politics into the workplace, i.e. force compelled speech, force people to salute, force people to do things that at the end of the day are fundamentally un-American, because at the end of the day, this country was built on dissent, and that's what makes me proud to be American.
Thank you so much, John. Okay, so now what we're going to do is I'm going to ask each of them a question, and then we're going to open it up to the floor for questions. And I'm going to start with Jim Nistella. So, Jim, you being the Chicago Bears fan, clearly you don't care about Kaepernick, right? what I really want to know, and this is not just a rhetorical question, I am not a sports-oriented person, but I am deeply entrenched in issues of social justice. And I want to know that for people that really like football and sports, is this protest, do you think that it is giving those people an opportunity to understand what is happening in this country, or is it causing greater division, do you think?
The football fans I know and know of, I think they probably would disfavor people kneeling during the national anthem. That's my view of football fans. They're not, my brother has a saying, a lot of football fans go to the games so they can get into fights. And he goes to games and he knows, you know, and, so there's a psychology there that, I mean, I like it. I think that Colin Kaepernick is a good thing for them to have to encounter. Is it going to change them? I hope so. But a lot of football fans they're very conservative. They're, you know.
So this is putting an issue before them, but it isn't necessarily enlightening them in any way, and it could actually be making a bad situation worse.
I hope that I'm surprised that it is enlightening them, but, you know, and I don't know whether it is or it isn't. I just know that a lot of football fans are just not open to that kind of flexible thought.
John, you were saying that we don't have de jure segregation, and so for most of this country's history, particularly after slavery, we did have state-sanctioned slavery, but we don't need state-sanctioned slavery because we have socially sanctioned segregation. And if you just drive down, go as far north as Sepulveda and go straight down, you will see clearly we have segregated neighborhoods. In fact, the average American does not live in a community that is desegregated. The average American lives next door to somebody that looks just like them. And it's particularly true in Southern California. So, Steve, I was just thinking about segregation, thinking about Brown v. Board of Education, the 1954 decision that said we shouldn't have segregation in schools, and here we are in 2018, and schools are even more segregated. Well, now that we have Kavanaugh, who's being considered as a Supreme Court justice, how do you think this issue, if he does get selected, how do you think his position will affect this?
I'm very concerned about the nomination of Brett Kavanaugh on a whole range of issues. We could do an entire evening on that. What I'm impressed by in the comments today is the following. There was a leading jurist who essentially said that it doesn't matter what the Constitution says in a dusty law book up on a shelf somewhere. It's whether liberty survives in the hearts of the people. And it seems to me that our task is to build a culture of tolerance, a culture of diversity, an appreciation of the true things that make America great. Not the ones that Donald Trump espouses, and not the ones that those who would repress freedoms espouse. And so much of our time and energy in the resistance has to be to convince a broad swath of America, that they need to stand for those who protest, that they need to stand for the dispossessed, those members of society that have been shunted aside, that are targeted by dominant forces in our country. That's why people, when the Muslim ban was announced, were in the streets and at LAX and elsewhere. And it's building that culture of tolerance and diversity that I think we each have to devote ourselves to. We can all make legal arguments on different propositions, and you've seen some excellent arguments in a whole range of context here tonight. But a Brett Kavanaugh can make legal arguments. He can take the very same language of the Constitution and turn it against those who are dispossessed, those who are the outsiders, those who don't have a voice. And that's what worries me a great deal. John just briefly alluded to a concept that I do want you to take away tonight, and that's the power of our state constitutions. We had a great Justice, William Brennan, of the United States Supreme Court, who's probably my favorite justice. I got to meet him once in Washington, D.C. after he had retired. He was an extraordinary justice. And he wrote a visionary article in the 1970s urging civil rights lawyers to look at your state constitutions, because you will not always have the Warren Court, which Brennan was such an instrumental part of. And you may not always have a court that upholds civil rights. And he was so visionary, he saw right into the future. And the appointment and possible confirmation of Brett Kavanaugh is going to solidify that conservative majority on this Supreme Court for generations to come. So we're not going to be able necessarily to use the U.S. Supreme Court to save us. We're going to have to use the political system, and in this one area, these possible use of our state courts. But beyond everything I've just said, it's in the people. And that's why Constitution Day, that Jim and I and others at the ACLU take to heart by fanning out into our high schools in this community and talking to young people about the Constitution. We've got to convince young people to uphold that culture of tolerance and diversity. And I think if we begin and work on that, I was at a political fundraiser for a bright man who's running for governor of Ohio, Rich Cordray, former head of the Consumer Affairs Department of the Obama administration and Attorney General of Ohio. And he said this new generation is the least bigoted, the least prejudiced. They've grown up knowing people to encourage those young people. We have to nurture them. And that, I think, is where our future lies.
Thank you, Steve. So there's a woman who's an attorney. Her name is Lonnie Lanier. And she wrote a book, Canaries in the Coal Mine. And her book talks about how the United States has a perfect indicator, a barometer, if you will, for determining how well we're doing with this experiment called democracy. And that barometer is black people. If you look at what's happening with black people, if anybody knows this, the metaphor, the canaries in the coal mine, canaries were used by coal miners. They would take these canaries into the coal mine with them. And I guess there's gas in the coal mine. Is it methane?
Yes.
So methane, they're inhaling methane, and at certain levels, it's so toxic, it will kill a human being, but it will kill the canary first. So they take the canary in with them, and if the canary dies, they know they need to get out. Well, that's kind of the role that black people have played in this country when we're taking the temperature of our democratic processes. So why is it that the rest of America should be concerned about this? Well, sadly, the oppressors don't just stop with black people. I mean, if you look at what the manufacturing sector of this country, what's happened? It started in Detroit. That was one of the big indicators, but it spreads. Eventually, it hurts everybody. And so we're the canaries. Well, one way to fight that is the power of proximity. See, segregation is a terrible thing for this country because we're so separated, we're not able to see the canaries. But the power of proximity allows us to be in each other's lives, to care about each other. It enables us to be empathetic. But for the vast majority of the time that black Americans have been here, we have been ousted from the public sphere. We don't have a voice in the media. The Trayvon Martin case became very public because of social media, non-traditional media. Jet Magazine helped to spread the word about Emmett Till. So I want to ask John about the public sphere and the First Amendment. And why is it that Colin Kaepernick pretty much had no alternatives?
Great question. And I think that ties into the constitutional issues as well. There's a whole body of case law under the First Amendment and free speech principles that talks about how you have certain rights, extra rights of freedom of speech, particularly in places called public forums. And, typically that would be, say, a town hall. That would be the quintessential public forum where, it's an area whose use is consistent with speech. In fact, it's an area where people gather, and we're supposedly told that in those areas you get maximum free speech rights. Well, there's an argument to be made that what is the closest public forum to what we have today? I mean, town halls, they're mostly gone. We live in gated communities where we have these fake mega malls that recreate some vision of a town hall that some construction magnate had, in the back rooms. Where fewer Americans are involved in civic society, unfortunately. Fewer Americans go to church. What do they do on Sunday? They watch football. People watch football. It's our town meeting. It's our ultimate public forum. And so when Colin Kaepernick or anyone else is given access to that forum, why not respect their right to be able to send a message, particularly when that message is one that's done in silence, is done gracefully, and not in a way that undermines the other things that are going on, namely the playing of a football game. There's a famous Supreme Court case called Tinker versus Des Moines that basically had a famous line about school children, saying that kids do not shed their First Amendment rights at the schoolyard gate. And it basically upheld the right of these students to do a silent protest against the war through the wearing of black armbands. And the court said, yes, you can't have kids screaming and yelling and engaging in things that would undermine the educational environment. But when you're doing a respectful, quiet protest that doesn't undermine the use of the space in any other way, that absolutely needs to be tolerated because that's the kind of country we are. And I think, one can take that lesson and apply it to Colin Kaepernick context and say, well, look, what's he doing? Who's he hurting in doing this? If anything, he's taking this very visible public forum, one which, by the way, is financed greatly by the public in these beautiful luxury stadiums that have been built, when the American public is watching, and he is using his drawing power, just like many, many other celebrities and many, many other millionaires and billionaires do, to send out the message he wants to send out. So why begrudge him that? Why stomp on his ability to do that? And I think there's an important lesson to this.
Well, thank you so much.
My question is, would the replacement of our national anthem, bombs bursting in air, with America the Beautiful, be one step towards dealing with this problem?
There are a lot of things that aren't taught in our history books. The average person doesn't learn this in high school. There's just so much. I do think it's an important discussion. Changing the national anthem is not going to change the hearts and minds of America. We got a whole lot of work we got to do there.
I'm very suspicious of compelled patriotism of any form. You know, the Pledge of Allegiance was not, we went for decades, if not a century, without a Pledge of Allegiance. It came in the late 1800s. And the famous One Nation Indivisible, that's how it was originally written. And as John pointed out in another context, it was in the Cold War era, in the Eisenhower administration, that the phrase "one nation indivisible" was divided by the phrase "under God," and that was literally carroted and inserted into "one nation indivisible," "one nation under God, indivisible," etc. I'm very suspicious. The Supreme Court cases alluded to struck down a compulsory pledge of allegiance. I think these are hollow substitutes for understanding the true values of equality and justice that this nation stands for. So I'm not sure switching out the particular anthem is the answer to that.
As a black woman, black mother, I can't stand hypocrisy. My thing is, when all those deaths were taking place, these players were not taking knees in and standing up and say, listen, President Obama, we want you to do something about this. We're not come to see you. We're not talking to you. And to you to do something with this inequality and social justice in our neighborhoods. So that's thing not to be addressed. And at some point, we got to make that clear. The last question I have here, because I talk to friends of all the time, as I read and study, about the deaths that take place in our neighborhoods, whoever will address that. And they always bring about the police brutality. We actually live in inner cities, okay? I actually know numbers. I'm a numbers person. And in 2016, I did a study, okay? There's about 200 police that killed black people. At that point, there were probably about 17, 18, maybe 20 kids that were killed in school shootings. One is too many. But then I could have 8,000 black kids that are killing themselves in the neighborhood with not one stinking word out of anybody's mouth. I'm glad people get woke right now, but I've been woke for years. So we need to address all those issues, just not one. But this one issue that we're talking about, which is very minor as far as numbers, compared to the 8,000. So thank you. Anybody want to address those issues, I appreciate it. And thank
The
you.
major difference between the Obama administration and the Trump administration is the Attorney General. So the Obama administration had Eric Holder and Loretta Lynch as Attorney Generals. In both cases, they took a very active role in investigating what was going on in Ferguson. The current Attorney General has pulled back on all of that. So the taking of the knee is an extension of, or a reflection of the opposition of how the Department of Justice, and I brought up the Department of Justice a few times, we have no law mandating the reporting of lethal use of force. We don't have that. Now we have a head of the Department of Justice who doesn't even want to look into these matters. So the taking of the knee is part of that. The thing about the 3,000 killings, 8,000. The United States, by far, exceeds every other country in murder rates. And that's not just with black people. That happens across the board because we just have this love affair with guns. Australia put a limit on gun ownership, and immediately their death rates by gun violence drastically reduced. But we have a country that insists that it's okay, and now we have an NRA, which is a major lobby, that is making sure that we just have guns everywhere. The types of violence that we see, we often hear the talk of black-on-black violence. Well, the truth of the matter is, violence occurs intra-racial. Most people who are white, who are murdered by white people. The same is true with the Latino community. The same is true with the black community and the Asian community. Unfortunately and sadly, we kill our own people. So the problem there is gun proliferation, and there has always been opposition to that.
In the workplace, the one remedy we do have is anti-discrimination laws. So if your employer were to choose between the t-shirts you were wearing on any basis that constituted invidious discrimination, favoring, say, Blue Lives Matter over a Black Lives Matter t-shirt, or anything on the basis of discrimination on the basis of any invidious class, then that is a place where one could go after such an employer. I couldn't quite understand your full question about enemy of the people, but if you were questioning that he said that, the full quote is, the fake news media, failing New York Times, CNN, NBC, and many more, is not my enemy, it is the enemy of the American people, full caps, sick. So Trump said that, and he said a lot more than that, attacking.
No. Have you seen anything that speaks to protests that were made against the anthem because of the third stanza? And then my second question has to do with when did taking a knee or kneeling in general, which is usually seen as a respectful act, become disrespectful?
There has been a protest. It hasn't gotten as much attention with the media, partly because it's something that hasn't really been picked up by the celebrity community. There is a documentary that was made by Morgan State University. You might want to do a Google search. They did a documentary about the anthem and Francis Scott Key, and it's a half hour. It's a wonderfully made movie. Lots of students have protested, but that's, as far as I know, that's the extent of it.
Taking a knee as a form.
I wonder how people would have felt if Colin Kaepernick was taking a knee to protest the fact that veterans aren't treated better. Would people have complained then?
And I want to build out another theme that's developing, and John really made this point. It was already a political act to sing the national anthem. To react to a political act with another political act should be equally protected. So I think that needs to be well developed.
Just real quick, the rules say for most sports teams you have to stand at attention with your hand over your heart for the national anthem. Those are the rules. Colin Kaepernick, the first time he did it, he actually sat down, and that was just for one game. And then a veteran, I don't know, we had veterans, a veteran said to him, maybe it would be better if you knelt down instead of sitting down, and that's why he chose to kneel down.
Political act. For some odd reason, the football arena has been highly militarized. And those planes, and even like during halftime, so there's a whole lot of political acting going on. It's just some political act. political act and causes people to lose their jobs.
First question is, Mr. Rohde mentioned that you could do a whole day on Kavanaugh issues, and I'm going to ask if you might consider doing maybe a half a day on Kavanaugh and a half a day of training people to organize and mobilize to stop his confirmation. So that's my first question. Thank you. My second question was also prompted, you mentioned Constitution Day, and it reminded me last year at Constitution Day, I discovered that the Constitution does not say anything about lifetime appointments for SCOTUS justices. It actually just says appointments during good behavior. And I want to ask you all to do your best to encourage the dialogue whenever you hear that lifetime appointment, to change it, to point out it's not supposed to be that way, it's supposed to be during good behavior, and ask, how can we better counter the treasonous Koch brothers Federalist Society and their accomplices' egregious packing of the courts with these right-wing corporatist extremists who ignore the Constitution's protections of we the people and pretend to believe that it was written to protect corporations instead of us. This is not good behavior. And what do you think of perhaps starting a movement to impeach, for example, Gorsuch for his lies to the Judiciary Committee and his bad behavior? Whether or not he gets impeached, a growing movement demanding such will have positive impacts nationwide.
Is the date of the Kavanaugh hearings. That's been announced in the Senate Judiciary Committee. None of you can look yourselves in the mirror if you are not on the telephone, not only calling Senator Feinstein and Senator Harris, but calling senators on that committee and other senators, especially the kind of swing senators that may vote against his nomination. What we do need to build a groundswell of opposition. I'm old enough to remember Robert Bork. We opposed his nomination and he was not confirmed. That's happened several times in history. Even deeper in our history are Carswell and Hainsworth during the Richard Nixon era, who were not approved. So we've got to put all our typical activism into opposing the Kavanaugh appointment. FDR was accused of trying to pack the court when he was unhappy with the anti-progressive rulings of the court. He threatened to add justices to the court. That idea, by the way, has come up recently. On good behavior, and in many of the things we talk about, let's be careful not to cut down all the trees to get to the devil, and then the devil turns on us. Because if we go after good behavior as the nature of their rulings, then if we can recapture the Supreme Court with so-called liberal justices, then we will have set a precedent that they will go after them for their rulings as being impeachable. So I think that's a dangerous road to go down. I'm glad to see Miguel here because we have talked about Constitution Day several times in this panel discussion tonight before you arrived. Miguel from the ACLU is one of the wonderful organizers of Constitution Day, and if anyone in this room on September 17 with some training wants to fan out, as Jim and others have done, you can be prepared and trained for Constitution Day this fall.
The recent election in St. Louis County for the district attorney's office by a black member of, I believe he was a city councilman in Ferguson. He was a city, he was a judge, a municipal judge, and he ran against a Democrat who was not horrible or anything like that.
players, and sometimes I saw a whole team of high school players. This started with one guy taking an action, and made it very clear that he was not trying to disrespect veterans, he was not trying to disrespect the flag. He was, as you said, he was standing up for racial equality, especially around shooting, and he captured the public imagination, really. I mean, here we are, a couple of years down the road, we're still honoring what he did. And I wonder if there's ways that we can get off the sidelines, and other than join Sharon and not watching NFL games, can honor that. I mean, how can we perpetuate that? I mean, he's taken a fairly heroic action that's costing him financially and at great risk to his livelihood. So in a way, I mean, he's a real patriot, and we ought to find a way to honor him.
The people who are engaged in this action are Black people. And I personally don't believe that we are going to make a major change in this country until more people get involved in this struggle. You and I, for those of you who don't know, that's my husband. So you and I had an argument early on in our relationship about the civil rights movement. And I will remind you that I was a child, I was a mere child at that time, during the 60s. He wasn't.
She likes to bring that up.
But he felt then that the civil rights movement had this huge impact on the country. Now, as a person who was a recipient of the changes that were made as a result of the civil rights movement, I look at the situation as, well, I don't like to look back and see how far we've come. I like to look at where we need to be. And when I look at where we need to be, I still see segregated schools. I still see segregated neighborhoods. I still see this huge disparity in net worth. I understand that Black people's health is hugely impacted by the problems that we have in this country. And I just don't think we're going to be able to fix this all by ourselves. We didn't make this mess ourselves, and we can't fix it by ourselves.
I want to emphasize that because I thought of it earlier when you talked about when a government moves against its most vulnerable and is not resisted, it will not be long before it moves against everyone. Many of you know the Reverend Martin Niemöller in Nazi Germany, who wrote, first they came for the communists, and I didn't speak up because I wasn't a communist. Then they came for the trade unionists, and I wasn't a trade unionist, so I didn't speak up. Then they came for the Jews, and I wasn't a Jew, so I didn't speak up. And he has a few more stanzas until he says, then they came for me, and by that time no one was left to speak up. One of the darkest chapters in American history was the internment of 120,000 Japanese Americans during World War II. Do you know that 2/3 of them were American citizens? Now that doesn't mean that that violation wasn't against all of them, citizen and non-citizen alike. All of their rights were violated by being swept up and interned and ripped from their homes and businesses. But this government at that time, inflamed by fear and patriotism and war, was willing to even intern its own U.S. citizens. So none of us should feel comfortable in a society in which these rights are being violated and in which racism is widespread and has not been eradicated, that we have the resegregation of neighborhoods and communities and schools. Progress is not promised to us irrespective of what we do about it. And I think the lessons of today and the way that Dick framed that question is what one person can do. And I'll finish by respecting separation of church and state, but invoking the Torah which said, "It is not our duty," and I'm paraphrasing here, "to solve all the problems, but it is our duty to do something about it." And that doing something about it individually and collectively is the best remedy against all of the injustices we've been talking about tonight.
So in defense of what I thought about the civil rights movement, I was a couple of years older than Sharon, and I was on the edge of it, and it was a time in our history when lots of people, black and brown and white, pulled together to focus on racial inequality, on racial justice, against great opposition, and move the ball a little bit. And what happened since is why you see schools not as segregated as they were, is we stopped doing that. We don't do that as much anymore. And then the answer to my question is, what do we do to honor Colin Kaepernick? I would say we're doing it tonight. Here we are, we're doing what we can, we're participating in the ACLU, we're interested in issues, we're standing up for them, you know, we're standing beside them, and I think not to break our arms patting ourselves on the back, but I think we ought to pat ourselves on the back a little bit.
I believe the networks are avoiding the players during the national anthem at the beginning of games, because I've never seen it, but I see pictures later. But what happens is there's this feeling when you play football, you band together. If you don't band together as a football team, it hurts your team, and everybody knows you all have to. Everybody tries to stay together in one spirit. So what the players are doing on the sideline, if Colin Kaepernick is kneeling down, and now other players everywhere are kneeling down, they're trying to do things at least that bring them all together. Maybe they're locking arms, but they're doing something so that when they go out there and play, it's as one team. And that's the good thing about this divisive feeling.
The best thing to do to honor is to protest all the issues, both the racial injustice issues. It's that on every Labor Day, there's a march in Wilmington that goes to Banning Park. The Human Rights Division of the United Teachers of Los Angeles has a contingent of which it welcomes everyone in every sign. I hope that everyone in this room who is capable, and if they don't want to, they can always kneel or sit down with their thoughts. As far as depending upon electing officials, we have to look at the record. The one who is the current district attorney is a black woman who ousted a conservative district attorney who was somewhat moderate or racist, depending upon your views. She has refused to do it. In Baltimore, it's an entirely black government at every level. They refuse to prosecute the cops, 6 cops that put Freddie Gray in a van and managed to have him come out of the van dead with a spinal injury. Yeah. In New York City, again, the mayor happens to not be black. He's an interracial marriage with a interracial family. He is the one that is putting, despite the fact that he was elected by everyone of viewpoints like here, into office, all those things, everywhere in the country, we have urging of electing officials, and not just Ohio, and the results are exact opposite of what one wants. And there was a film called Selma by Ava DuVernay, I may be not, she had outlined that President Johnson, who is my very first protest on a different matter, was a racist and was opposed to the civil rights movement at the very moment he signed it. But because there were protests in the streets, there was pressure put down. Another thing that happened in this city is in 1994, there was a ballot initiative called 187 that was going to deny educational, health, and other services. It passed by, initially was going to be passed by a 3-1 margin, but because of protests, it passed, the margin was reduced literally by 15%, and there was the biggest march in the city's history up to that time. And the judge, the particular judge happened to be liberal, but the rest of the judges weren't. That's what won the overturning of that thing. So when you think of, whenever I hear that there are people conservative or they go to football games, not go to football games, they go to hockey games and some other conservative things, I live with various causes and I get reception. So the woman who asked about why there was no protest against during the Obama administration, I think they had a praise that all the backward thing, you have a progressive figure who you rely on, or we have very good attorneys who I compliment your work, but relying on them without supplementing with actions in the street is counterproductive.
Thank you so much. Thank the panelists. This was really informative.